My name is Alexander Hale, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed the greatest dangers in life were things like tax audits and rush hour traffic. I was a city person, born and bred. The wilderness was something you saw on a documentary, narrated by a soothing British voice, not something you experienced. My grandfather, Thomas Hale, was the opposite. He was a man carved from the very mountains he called home, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by decades of sun and wind, his hands as tough and calloused as old leather. He lived his entire life in a small, hand-built cabin nestled deep within the great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. It was a place where the morning mist clung to the valleys like a shroud, and the silence was so profound it had a weight of its own. As a child, I'd spent a few summers there. I remember the smell of pine and damp earth, the taste of fresh spring water, and the comforting scent of my grandfather's pipe tobacco. He taught me how to track a deer, how to identify edible plants, and how to read the stars. To me, he was a giant, a man in perfect harmony with nature. But there was always a part of him, a shadow in his eyes when he looked towards the deepest parts of the woods, that I could never quite understand. He had his own ways, his own superstitions, which my grandmother would dismiss with a wave of her hand as mountain nonsense. When my grandmother passed, he retreated even further into his solitude. Our phone calls became less frequent, his voice more distant. Then, 3 weeks ago, I got the call. A heart attack, swift and sudden. He was 82. The funeral was a small affair. A few old-timers from the nearest town, a distant cousin, and me. After, his lawyer, a portly man named Mr. Gable, handed me a set of keys and a large, dusty wooden box secured with a simple brass latch. "He left it all to you, Alex," Mr. Gable said, his voice gentle. "The cabin, the land, everything. He was very specific about it. He also said you were to open this box only when you were at the cabin, and only when you were alone." My heart ached. The cabin was my last tangible connection to him. I decided then and there I would drive up that weekend to sort through his things, to breathe in that mountain air one last time and say a proper goodbye in the place he loved most. I packed a bag, threw it in my car, and began the long drive from the concrete sprawl of the city to the winding, tree-lined roads of the Smokies. The journey was a slow transition from one world to another. Skyscrapers gave way to rolling hills, and soon, the hills swelled into the majestic, blue, hazed mountains that gave the region its name. The final leg of the journey was a gravel road, barely wide enough for one car, that snaked its way up the mountainside. My sedan complained, but it managed. The cabin stood exactly as I remembered it, a sturdy structure of dark logs with a wide porch and a stone chimney. It looked small and lonely against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the forest. I unlocked the heavy oak door, and the familiar scent of old wood smoke, and something else, something uniquely him, washed over me. It was like stepping into a memory. I spent the afternoon exploring the cabin, my fingers tracing the dusty surfaces. Everything was neat, orderly, just as he would have kept it. His favorite armchair by the hearth, a worn copy of Moby Dick. On the side table, his collection of whittled birds on the mantelpiece. It was all so painfully familiar. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, I remembered the box. I brought it to the main table, the wood cool and smooth beneath my fingers. With a click, the brass latch opened. Inside there was no money, no old photographs, no sentimental keepsake. There was only a single object, a thick, leather-bound journal. The leather was worn and cracked with age. His name, Thomas Hale, was embossed on the cover in faded gold lettering. I opened it. The pages were filled with his familiar, spidery handwriting. But this wasn't a diary of his daily life. The first page had a title, written in thick, deliberate strokes: rules for surviving at the cabin. I blinked, confused. Surviving. I read on. "Alex, if you are reading this, then I am gone. This cabin, this land, it is yours now. But it is not as peaceful as it seems. These mountains are old, older than any map, and things live here. Things that were here long before us, and will be here long after. The rules in this book are not suggestions. They are not the ramblings of a crazy old man. They are your only defense. Follow them to the letter, and you might see the sunrise. Ignore them, and your soul will become just another whisper on the wind. I love you, son. Be safe." A chill, completely unrelated to the evening air, crept down my spine. It was so unlike him. My grandfather was a practical man, not one for flights of fancy. I turned the page. Rule A1, and do not, under any circumstances, look out the windows after the sun has fully set. You might hear noises, tapping, scratching, voices. Ignore them. What you see out there in the dark is not meant for your eyes, and if it sees you looking back, it will know you are here, and it will want to come in. I let out a short, nervous laugh. It had to be a joke, a final, morbid prank from a man who spent too much time alone. I glanced at the window. The last sliver of orange sun was vanishing, and the forest was a wall of impenetrable black. I felt a sudden, absurd urge to pull the curtains shut. I shook my head, dismissing the feeling. I continued reading. Rule P2, the fire in the hearth must be kept burning from dusk until dawn. It cannot go out. Not even for a minute. The light keeps some of them at bay. Use only the wood from the shed. The wood you find on the forest floor. It's their wood. You don't want to burn their wood. My eyes flickered to the hearth. It was cold and black. A pile of logs and kindling sat in a brass bucket beside it, presumably from the shed. A sense of unease was starting to curdle in my stomach. This was elaborate. I got up, knelt before the fireplace, and began building a fire. It felt silly, like I was humoring a ghost, but the growing darkness and the profound silence of the cabin were beginning to get to me. Soon, a cheerful, crackling fire pushed back the gloom, its warmth a welcome comfort. I returned to the journal. Rule P3E, if you hear a woman singing a lullaby outside, go to the bedroom immediately. Lock the door. Do not make a sound. Do not listen to the words of the song. She sounds sweet, but she is not singing for you. She is singing for what she has lost, and she is always looking for a replacement. Okay, this was getting specific and creepy. A singing woman. I tried to rationalize it. A neighbor. No one lived for miles. A hiker. Lost in the dark. The thought was more unsettling than the rule itself. Rule Y4, seen at precisely 3:33 a.m., you will hear a knock on the front door. It will be 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. It is not a person. Do not open the door. Do not ask who is there. Do not even approach the door. Brace a chair against it if you must. He only knocks for a few minutes. He will go away if he believes the house is empty. My blood ran cold. 3:33 a.m. The specificity was terrifying. I looked at the heavy oak door, now a dark, imposing rectangle in the firelight. The simple iron bolt that secured it suddenly seemed flimsy, inadequate. I slammed the journal shut. This was insane. My grandfather, a man I respected and admired, had apparently spent his final years descending into a paranoid delusion. Grief, I told myself. Loneliness. It had warped his mind. The rules were a product of that. A sad, tragic fantasy. I tried to shake it off. I made myself some coffee, the perking sound a small, reassuringly normal noise in the oppressive quiet. I sat in his armchair, the warmth of the fire on my face, and tried to read his copy of Moby Dick. But the words blurred. My mind kept drifting back to the journal. Do not look out the windows. Keep the fire lit. Tap. It was a small sound, from the window to my left. A tiny, sharp rap, like a fingernail against the glass. My head snapped up, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs. I froze, every muscle tensed. It was probably just a branch, I told myself, swaying in the wind. A pine cone falling. There was a rational explanation. There had to be. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was more insistent, sharper, deliberate. It was not a branch. My gaze was locked on the window, a black, reflective square in the cabin wall. I could see my own terrified face mirrored in it, illuminated by the fire. The rule screamed in my mind. Don't look. Don't let it see you. My breath hitched. I wanted to look. The curiosity was a physical itch, a desperate need to see what was making the sound, to confront the unknown. My body was tense, ready to spring up and tear the curtains aside. But my grandfather's voice, his warning, was a cold anchor in my gut. I squeezed my eyes shut and focused on the fire, the crackling of the logs, the hiss of the sap. I recited street names from my city, multiplication tables, anything to distract myself from the sound. Scrape, a new sound, a long, drawn-out scratching against the glass, like claws, or long, dirty fingernails. It moved from one side of the pane to the other, a slow, exploratory sound that made the hair on my arms stand on end. My heart felt like it was going to burst. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. I grabbed the journal from the table, my hands trembling. I needed to read more. I needed to know what else I was supposed to do. I flipped past the rules I'd already read, my eyes scanning the page. Rule 25. The cabin has a root cellar. The door is in the kitchen floor. You must check that it is bolted from the outside every night before you go to bed. Some things learn to use doors. My blood turned to ice. The root cellar. I remembered it from my childhood. A dark, musty hole in the ground where my grandmother kept preserves. I never liked it. It always felt wrong. The scratching at the window stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. It was heavy, expectant. Was it gone? Or was it just waiting? I forced myself to my feet, my legs feeling like lead. I had to check the cellar door. I couldn't ignore this. Not now. The fire was my only companion, its light casting my long, dancing shadow ahead of me as I walked into the kitchen. The kitchen was small and cold, away from the hearth's warmth. In the center of the floor was a square trapdoor with a heavy iron ring, and next to it, set into the floorboards, was a thick, iron bolt. It was unlatched. The bolt was slid back, resting in the open position. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even been in the kitchen since I arrived, other than to make coffee. My grandfather was a meticulous man. He would never have left it unlocked. My breathing was ragged, shallow gasps in the cold air. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical reason. Vibration from my car on the gravel road. An earthquake. No, it was impossible. Something had opened it. Or, worse, something had come out and failed to lock it on its way. With a shaking hand, I reached down and slammed the heavy bolt home. The thunk of the iron was a small, definitive sound in the terrifying silence. I stood up, my back pressed against the kitchen counter, my eyes darting around the shadows. The cabin no longer felt like a place of comforting memories. It felt like a trap. The walls seemed to be closing in, the darkness outside a living, breathing entity. The rules weren't a prank. They weren't a delusion. They were real. And the night had only just begun. I looked at the clock on the wall. 9:17 p.m., hours to go until sunrise. Hours of darkness, filled with things that tapped on windows, sang deadly lullabies, and knocked on doors. I was alone, miles from anyone, with only a book of terrifying rules standing between me and the things that lived in the shadows of the Smoky Mountains. The silence after I bolted the cellar door was louder than any sound I had ever heard. It was a heavy, oppressive silence, pregnant with horrifying possibilities. I backed away from the kitchen slowly, my eyes fixed on the trapdoor, as if it might burst open at any moment. The walk back to the armchair by the hearth felt like crossing a minefield. Every dancing shadow, every creak of the old cabin's timbers, made my heart leap. I sank into the chair, snatching up the journal. It wasn't just a book anymore. It was a lifeline, the only weapon I had against the unseen darkness that was closing in around my grandfather's cabin. The fire crackled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the cold dread in my chest. I tossed another log on, watching the flames greedily lick the wood. Rule Fate 2 echoed in my mind. The fire must be kept burning. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages past the rules I'd already encountered. My rational mind was screaming in denial, but a primal survival instinct was shrieking that every word in this book was a terrifying truth. I had to know more. I had to be ready for what was coming next. Rule Fate 6e. If you see a reflection in a window that is not your own, even for a moment, close your eyes and count slowly to 50. Do not acknowledge it. It feeds on attention. I swallowed hard, the memory of my own reflection in the glass, when the tapping started flashing in my mind. What if I had seen something else? What if another face had been staring back at me from the darkness? The thought made me nauseous. I vowed not to look at the windows again, no matter what. Rule Paint 7a. The carved wooden birds on the mantel are your allies. If one of them falls, it means something has breached the outer defenses of the cabin. You are no longer safe in the main room. My eyes shot up to the small, whittled birds lined up on the mantelpiece. They had seemed so simple, so insignificant, just the hobby of an old man. Now, they held a new, sinister importance. They were sentinels, an early warning system. I counted them, 7 in total, each frozen in a different pose of flight. Rule Pate 80, there is an iron chest in the bedroom. The key is taped beneath the leftmost hearthstone. Inside are supplies you may need. Salt, iron nails. Do not use them unless a rule tells you to. They are finite. A flicker of hope. Supplies, weapons. It was something tangible in this intangible nightmare. I didn't hesitate. I knelt by the fireplace, feeling for a loose edge on the far, left stone. And there it was. The stone shifted slightly. Taped to the underside was a small, cold, antique iron key. I scrambled to the bedroom, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. The room was small and Spartan: a bed, a wardrobe, and at the foot of the bed, the black iron chest. It looked ancient and strong, bound with thick straps, though the lock itself looked surprisingly delicate. I inserted the key and turned. The click of the mechanism was deafening in the silence. I heaved the heavy lid open. A musty smell of metal and earth, mixed with dried herbs, wafted out. Inside, there were no guns or knives as I had half hoped. There was something far stranger. Several small, tightly bound canvas bags filled with coarse sea salt. A wooden box full of slightly rusted iron nails. And, most bizarrely, several small glass vials of clear liquid, each containing a sprig of rosemary. These weren't survival supplies. These were the tools of an exorcist, of someone fighting an ancient evil. I closed the chest, any sense of security I'd gained vanishing. It was replaced by the heavy understanding that my grandfather's fight hadn't been against wildlife or human intruders. It had been a spiritual one, a long-running war against things that existed outside of my comprehension. I returned to the fire, the journal open on my lap. Time crawled by at a torturous pace. Every minute was a small victory. I kept the fire fed, and I kept glancing at the 7 wooden birds. They remained still. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the frantic drumming of my own heart. Then, I heard it. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I was imagining it. A melody, drifting on the night air. A woman's voice, humming a lullaby. It was a simple, sweet tune, yet it was filled with a beautiful sadness. Rule Fay 3 slammed into my consciousness. If you hear a woman singing a lullaby outside, go to the bedroom immediately. Lock the door. Do not make a sound. A moment of hesitation. The voice was so pathetic. It didn't sound threatening. It sounded like a mother singing to her sleeping child. Maybe it was a lost hiker. Maybe she needed help. No, my grandfather's voice roared in my head. She is not singing for you. I launched myself from the chair, bolting for the bedroom and slamming the door shut. I threw the deadbolt and twisted the lock. The singing grew louder, as if she were walking closer to the cabin. The lyrics were in a language I didn't recognize, an ancient tongue that sounded like rustling leaves and running water. But the emotion was universal. It was loss. A painful, yearning loss. The singing stopped directly outside my bedroom window. I stood frozen in the center of the room, holding my breath. I felt an overwhelming urge to look, to comfort this poor woman, to tell her everything would be okay. But my grandfather's rule echoed. She is looking for a replacement. I backed away from the window, pressing my hands over my ears, but I could still hear it. It seeped through the wood, through my bones, into my soul. I sank to the floor, curling into a ball, praying for it to stop. After an eternity, the singing began to fade. It grew softer and softer, until it was nothing more than the sound of the wind in the trees. I stayed on the floor for several long minutes, shaking. The returning silence was almost as terrifying as the song had been. Finally, I summoned the courage to stand and unlock the door. I stepped out into the main room. The first thing I noticed was the fire. It had burned down to glowing embers. Panic flared in me, and I frantically added more kindling, blowing on it until the flames caught again. I had almost broken Rule 82. I glanced at the old wall clock. 1:47 a.m., hours to go until dawn, and the most dreaded rule was still ahead of me. Rule Fay 4. I spent the next hour in a state of hyper-vigilance. I didn't dare sit down. I paced the small room, clutching the iron fire poker like a club. I kept the fire roaring and my eyes on the 7 birds. They remained steadfast. The clock ticked mercilessly toward 3:33 a.m. The tension in the cabin became a physical thing. I reread Rule 54 over and over. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. It is not a person. Do not open the door. I followed its advice. I dragged my grandfather's heavy armchair across the floor and wedged it against the front door, bracing it under the knob. It was a flimsy barricade, but it was something. 3:30 a.m. My heart was a war drum. 3:31 a.m. I wiped slick sweat from my forehead. 3:32 a.m. The cabin fell unnervingly silent. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Everything was waiting. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the front door. The second hand on the clock swept onward, each tick a hammer blow of fate. It reached the 12. 3:33 a.m. The silence held. A second passed. Then another. Nothing. Maybe it wouldn't come tonight. Maybe I was lucky. KMOC. The sound ripped through the silence. It was deep and resonant, as if someone had struck the thick oak with a massive fist. It vibrated through the floorboards and up into my bones. KMOC. The second one came a few seconds later. Harder. More powerful. The chair I had wedged against the door rattled ominously. I held my breath, staring at the door in abject terror. KNOCK. The third. The final. This one was filled with a malevolent, ancient patience. It was not the knock of a human. It was the knock of something that wanted in, and it knew I was here. The third knock echoed into nothingness, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. I stood paralyzed in the center of the room, my knuckles white on the fire poker, my entire being focused on the thick oak door. The heavy armchair wedged beneath the knob was my only comfort, a fragile dam against a malevolent ocean. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just waited for the wood to splinter, for the lock to burst. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The knocker did not try again. Instead, a new sound began, a low, guttural scraping at the very bottom of the door. It was the sound of something heavy and dense being dragged across the wooden porch, right up to the threshold. It was followed by a soft, wet sniffing sound, exploring the crack between the door and the floor. It was searching for a way in. It knew I was there. It was patient. I remained frozen, a statue of terror. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but my body refused to obey. The rules were clear. Do not open the door. Do not ask who is there. Do not even approach the door. My only defense was to pretend the house was empty, a hollow shell devoid of the life it so desperately craved. The sniffing continued for what felt like hours, a slow, methodical examination of my flimsy fortress. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I felt a change in the atmosphere, a lessening of the intense pressure. The presence, whatever it was, had moved on. For now. The release of tension was so abrupt that my knees buckled. I stumbled back to the armchair, my body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. I had survived. I had followed the rule, and I had survived. But the relief was fleeting, immediately replaced by the horrifying knowledge that this was just one trial among many, and the night was far from over. My eyes fell upon the journal, still open on the floor, where I dropped it. I needed more information. I had to know what other horrors these mountains held. With a trembling hand, I picked it up and forced myself to read on, the crackling fire my only witness. Rule 590, the things outside can mimic sounds they have heard. A crying baby, a wounded animal, a familiar voice. Your mind will want to believe them. Your heart will want to help. Do not. Compassion is a weapon they will use to get inside your soul. This rule sent a fresh wave of ice through my veins. I thought of the woman's lullaby. It had sounded so full of sorrow, so real. What if the knocker had tried a different tactic? What if it had called to me in my mother's voice, or my grandfather's? Would I have been strong enough to resist? I wasn't sure, and that uncertainty terrified me. Rule Fay 10A. Do not eat any food you find in the cabin that was not sealed in a can or a jar when you arrived. Some things can spoil more than just the flesh. They can spoil the mind. Stick to the canned beans. They're bland, but they're safe. I glanced at the kitchen, at the open bag of bread and the small wheel of cheese I had bought on my way up. I had been snacking on them earlier. A paranoid thought wormed its way into my brain. Had something already tainted them? Was the fear I was feeling entirely my own? I pushed the thought away. The rule said food found in the cabin. My food was from the outside world. It had to be safe. Still, I resolved to only eat the canned goods from now on. Rule FLNT. If you smell the scent of damp soil and sweet, rotting flowers, it means one of them is close to the walls. It is trying to find a way through the wood itself. Hold your breath for as long as you can. The scent can lull you into a stupor, a waking dream from which you will not want to wake. The specificity of these rules was what made them so horrifying. They weren't vague warnings, they were detailed instructions, born from decades of terrifying experience. My grandfather had lived this nightmare day in and day out. The thought filled me with a profound sadness and a newfound respect for the strength he must have possessed. I checked the clock. 4012 a.m. The sky outside was still a sheet of impenetrable black. Dawn was a distant, desperate hope. I added more logs to the fire, the simple, physical act a small anchor in the swirling chaos of my fear. I sat, listening, my senses stretched to their breaking point. Thud. The sound was soft, but it cut through the quiet like a gunshot. It came from the mantelpiece. My head snapped up. One of the carved wooden birds, a small, delicate sparrow, had fallen from its perch. It lay on its side on the cold hearthstone, its tiny wooden wings askew. Rule Fight 7 screamed in my mind. If one of them falls, it means something has breached the outer defenses of the cabin. You are no longer safe in the main room. A primal, gut-wrenching panic seized me. The outer defenses. What did that even mean? The invisible line of protection my grandfather had somehow built around this place had been broken. Something was in. Not inside the cabin, not yet, but it was past the first gate. My eyes darted back to the journal, my fingers fumbling with the pages. There had to be another rule, something to do, a countermeasure. I found it near the back, the handwriting more frantic, more rushed than the others. Rule Fay 12: if a bird falls, the wards are compromised. You must reinforce the thresholds immediately. Use the salt from the iron chest. Pour a thick, unbroken line across every windowsill, and at the base of every door leading outside. Leave no gaps. They are repelled by the salt, but only if the line is perfect. Then, take one of the iron nails and hammer it into the floor in front of the hearth. It will ground the cabin's energy and strengthen the remaining wards. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted to the bedroom, threw open the iron chest, and grabbed one of the canvas bags of salt. It was surprisingly heavy. I also grabbed a single, rust-colored iron nail and the small hammer I'd seen in the chest. As I ran back into the main room, I heard it. A soft, wet, dragging sound from the front porch. The same sound I'd heard after the knocking, but closer now, more confident. Alex. The voice was my grandmother's. It was her voice exactly. The slight tremor, the gentle, loving tone she always used with me. It came from just outside the front door. Alex, honey, what are you doing in there? Let your old grandma in. It's so cold out here. Rule Fay 9. It can mimic sounds. My heart shattered. It was a cruel, twisted violation of my most cherished memories. Tears streamed down my face, but my hands didn't stop. I knelt at the front door, the bag of salt shaking, and began to pour. A thick, white line of crystals formed on the floorboards. Don't be rude, Alexander. The voice chided, the warmth gone, replaced by a sharp, impatient edge. Your grandfather taught you better manners than that. Open this door. I ignored it, moving to the back door. My hands working frantically to pour another perfect line. The dragging sound moved with me, circling the cabin. Next, the windows. As I approached the first one, the one where the tapping had started, my grandmother's voice was right there, whispering against the glass. I see you, Alex. Hiding in the dark. You can't hide from me. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing only on the task, on the feel of the salt pouring through my fingers. I finished the first window and moved to the next. The voice began to change, to warp. The loving tone stretched and distorted, becoming something monstrous and guttural, a grotesque parody of the woman I loved. I'll hufef, and I'll puff, and I'll owe you your soul. It shrieked, the sound vibrating through the very logs of the cabin. I finished the last windowsill just as a new sensation hit me, a smell, the cloying sweetness of rotting flowers in the damp, earthy scent of a freshly dug grave. Rule 11. It was right outside the wall. I held my breath, my lungs burning, my vision starting to swim with black spots. I stumbled back to the hearth, the iron nail and hammer clutched in my hand. I dropped to my knees before the fire, placed the tip of the nail against the floorboards, and brought the hammer down. Hack! The sound was clean and final. As the iron nail bit into the wood, a low hum vibrated through the cabin, and the oppressive smell and the horrifying voice from outside vanished instantly. Cut off. Silence returned. I gasped for air, collapsing onto the floor, my body slick with sweat. I looked around the room. The salt lines gleamed in the firelight, thin white lines of hope. The fallen bird still lay on the hearth. The single iron nail stood sentinel in the floor. The clock read 5:38 a.m. I had done it. I had survived. I spent the final hour before sunrise huddled in the armchair, watching those salt lines as if my life depended on it, which it did. As the first, faint, gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the oppressive atmosphere inside the cabin finally began to lift. The shadows seemed less menacing, the silence less threatening. When the sun finally crested the mountain, flooding the room with glorious, warm light, I felt a wave of relief so powerful it was physically painful. I had made it through the night. I stood up on shaky legs, and for the first time since sunset, I walked to a window and looked out. The forest was beautiful, serene. The morning mist rising from the trees like gentle ghosts. It looked exactly like the peaceful mountain landscape I remembered from my childhood. But I knew better now. I knew what walked in the shadows, what sang in the dark, what knocked on the doors of lonely cabins. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone despite the morning sun, that I would have to do it all over again tonight. Daylight did not bring peace, only a temporary reprieve. The terror of the night clung to me like the mountain mist, a cold, damp film on my soul. I was exhausted, every muscle aching from tension, but sleep was an impossible luxury. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the distorted, hateful face of my grandmother's mimic, heard the deep, resonant knock that wasn't human. I had survived, yes, but the victory felt hollow. The sun was a spotlight on a stage, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that the play would resume the moment the lights went down. I couldn't just wait for the next onslaught. I couldn't spend another night as a cornered animal. My grandfather didn't just survive here, he lived here. He must have had a system, a routine, a way of fighting back that went beyond just huddling by the fire. The journal was my key, but I needed to understand the battlefield. Fueled by a desperate mix of fear and adrenaline, I forced myself to eat 2 cans of cold beans, the metallic taste a grim reminder of Rule Fate 10. Then, I began my investigation. I started with the outside of the cabin, stepping out into the morning sun, with the iron fire poker clutched in my hand. The world looked deceptively normal. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, and the air was crisp and clean. But the evidence of the night's horrors was there if you knew where to look. At the base of the front door, deep googe, like scratches marred the thick oak, far too wide and jagged to be from any normal animal. It looked as though something had tried to claw its way through solid wood. I circled the cabin, my eyes scanning the ground. Beneath the window where the singing woman had stood, the grass was yellowed and dead in a perfect circle, as if poisoned from the roots up. A faint, sickly, sweet smell of rot still lingered in the air, even in the bright sunlight. I felt a profound sense of violation. These things weren't just attacking the cabin, they were poisoning the land itself. My next stop was the woodshed. According to Rule Fate 2, this was the only safe source of firewood. The shed was a small, windowless structure a short distance from the cabin. Inside, stacks of perfectly cut and dried logs reached the ceiling. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I noticed something else. Carved into the inside of the door was a complex, circular symbol, similar to a compass rose but with intricate, spidery runes instead of directions. And on the end of every single log, a smaller, simpler version of the same symbol had been branded into the wood. My grandfather hadn't just been chopping wood, he'd been consecrating it, turning each log into a small ward against the dark. The fire wasn't just light and heat, it was a weaponized barrier of holy flame. The discovery galvanized me. This was a war, and my grandfather had been a soldier. I had to think like one. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing. I spent the next several hours ransacking the place, not for valuables, but for knowledge. I looked for hidden compartments, loose floorboards, anything that might hold more of his secrets. My search led me to his bedroom, to the old, musty wardrobe. Behind a false back panel, I found another box. This one was smaller, made of dark wood, and filled not with supplies, but with more of my grandfather's writings. There were newspaper clippings of missing hikers dating back 50 years, hand-drawn maps of the area with strange symbols marking certain locations, and several more, smaller journals. These journals were different from the Book of Rules. They were his bestiary, his field notes on the enemy. I sat on the floor, my back against the bed, and read for hours, my blood running colder with every page. He wrote about the singing woman, or the lure, a spirit of profound loss that seeks to steal the living to replace the child it lost to the river centuries ago. He described the knocker, an ancient, territorial entity that guards the mountain's deepest parts, a thing of stone and shadow that despises warmth and life. He called it Old Stony, and he wrote about others, things I hadn't yet encountered. The Watchers, disembodied red lights that were the eyes of something vast and hungry that slumbered beneath the mountains. The Path, Twister, a trickster entity that could rearrange the forest itself to lead travelers into traps. As I read, a new set of rules began to form in my mind, gleaned from his desperate, terrified scrawlings. Rule Fay 3rd Trinity, the forest is not your friend after dark. Do not leave the clearing around the cabin. The paths you know from the day will not be the same. They will lead you to the water, or to the rocks, but never back home. Rule Fay 4 2A, if you see two small red lights hovering in the woods, get inside immediately and do not look at them. They are the watchers. If they see your face, they will report it to their master, and the mountain itself will turn against you. Rule Fun 15D. The mirror in the bathroom is a weak spot, a potential door. My grandfather had covered it with a thick, black cloth, secured with duct tape. The journal entry was stark: keep it covered. At night it reflects what they want to see, not what is there. If the cloth falls, break the mirror. A shattered door is better than an open one. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and red that no longer looked beautiful, only ominous. The second night was coming, but this time I would be more prepared. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the cabin's guardian. I checked the salt lines from the previous night, reinforcing any thin spots. I picked up the fallen sparrow from the hearth and placed it carefully in the iron chest, whispering a thank you. I found the heavy black cloth over the bathroom mirror and pressed down on the tape, ensuring it was secure. I ate more cold beans. I kept the fire poker close. As dusk settled, a new kind of silence fell. It wasn't the expectant silence of the first night. It was a hunting silence. They knew I had survived. They knew I had reinforced the wards. Tonight would be different. They would test me in new ways. The first sign came just after full dark. It wasn't a sound. It was a light. Through a small gap in the curtains of a side window, I saw them. Two small, ruby, red pinpricks of light hovering in the woods about 100 yards away. Rule Fay 14. The watchers. They weren't moving, just floating there, observing. I felt a cold, analytical intelligence behind them, a stark contrast to the raw emotion of the lure or the brute force of the knocker. I quickly closed the gap in the curtains, my heart hammering. They had seen the cabin's light. They knew someone was home. An hour passed. The red lights remained, unmoving. Then, a new sound began. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, but it wasn't coming from a window or a door. It was coming from the roof. Tap, 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 tap. It sounded like rain, but the sky had been clear. The sound moved slowly, methodically, from one end of the roof to the other, then back again. It was the sound of something walking up there. Something light on its feet. I grabbed the journal, frantically searching for a rule, a mention of anything on the roof. I found nothing. This was new. This was an improvisation. My grandfather's rules were a guide, but the enemy was capable of adapting. The tapping stopped directly above me. A scraping sound followed, the sound of sharp claws digging into the wooden shingles. Then, a new sound, one that chilled me to my very marrow. A soft, childish giggle echoed down the chimney, followed by a whisper that seemed to slither down with the smoke. "Can I come in? I lost my ball."